Well, good afternoon. We are here with National Farmers Union President Roger Johnson and the President of the American Farm Bureau Federation, Zippy Duvall, and also very pleased to be joined with the Secretary for Rural Development for USDA, Anne Hazlett. So thought that we would start off by each of the panelists to give a little bit of background of where they're coming from, and then we'll go from there. So Roger, do you want to?
Sure. If I could, I mean, you all know who I am and where I grew up and all that kind of stuff, so I'm going to skip that. But I do want to extend a special thank you to my friend Zippy Duvall and my friend Anne Hazlett. Zippy was kind enough to invite me to the American Farm Bureau Convention a couple months ago in Nashville, and we agreed that this was an issue in advance of that, actually, that we as two organizations, the two largest general farm organizations in the country, really wanted to highlight. And I think as we get into this panel conversation, you'll understand why that is the case. So I'll turn it over to Zippy and then to Anne.
So I'm going to go to Anne first, since ladies go first.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Anne Hazlett, and I first became involved in the issue of opioid misuse and substance abuse in rural communities. I'm from Indiana. I first became involved in this issue in 2015 when a small town in south central Indiana, about 45 minutes north of Louisville, Kentucky, the town of Austin, Indiana, made national headlines after they experienced a significant disease outbreak after there was substantial addiction issues in the community. And following that incident, as well as a lot of opportunities that I've had to work on this issue in ministry in West Virginia, I really see it as a grave challenge for rural communities, and I'm thrilled to be in the role that I'm in at USDA right now, Rural Development, because I think it's an opportunity really for us to address prosperity and hope, which is often at the root of this challenge. So thank you for the chance to be here today.
And I'm Zippy Duvall, and I'm a farmer from Georgia. I spent 30 years and all my childhood growing up on a dairy and ended up buying it from my father. So I spent 30 years dairying, and somewhere in the middle 80s when we were all just struggling trying to get through that crisis during the 80s, I expanded into poultry. My wife and I and our son, we grow about 750,000 broilers a year. I've got about 400 mama cows now because I'm ended up doing what I wanted to do as a child, and that was be a beef guy, but couldn't figure out how to make a living at it back then, so I ended up dairying back then. So, but I tell everybody, and everybody laughs at me, if everybody loves their dog. Well, if you could get a miniature cow and put a diaper on it, I'd take it with me everywhere I went to, because I just love old cow. And I tell Roger that I kind of live a congressman's life, because about Thursday afternoon, middle of the day Friday, I'm trying to find a plane back home, go back to Georgia, because that's where I go back and become part of reality. My second son is a veterinarian, and he's keeping the farm going. And I told Roger I had to show up and tell him I'm watching a checkbook, see what he's doing there. So, but I dearly love to go back to the farm and be involved there too. So. But being Farm Bureau President, I've been to the first 2 years as President, I made a commitment to go to all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And as I traveled this country, I met a lot of you and a lot of your neighbors, and just the vastness of American agriculture is just unbelievable. I thought I knew agriculture, but really and truly we only know our little piece of the agriculture world that we live in. And as I traveled, I saw the seriousness of this issue, and I think this is a great way for us to highlight it and bring some, let us talk about it in our communities. So I want to say thank you to Roger. When I came to town as a newbie in Washington, I committed to Roger. I said me and him was going to be good friends, and we'd find things to work together on. And I think this is going to be one of a long list that we'll work together on. So I'm proud to be here with you today, and I'm proud to be a partner with Roger.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, this afternoon I wanted to point out that this is being live streamed on Facebook Live on the National Farmers Union Facebook page, and it's also being live streamed on Periscope on Twitter. Now, we all know that this isn't a happy topic, but it's important, and it's really important, and it's hitting our rural communities hard in ways that we would have never thought of just a generation ago. And I think it's true leadership when the two national organizations of the National Farmers Union and the American Farm Bureau Federation banded together and started sitting down and figuring out how do we start addressing this issue. And one of the first things that they did is they decided to go ahead and commission a survey. The survey is with Morning Consult. And with this survey, some of the results were pretty amazing. I thought it was amazing that 3 out of 4 farmers surveyed have been personally impacted by the opioid crisis, either family, friends, or even personally, that this was something that impacted them. And, you know, part of what came out of the Morning Consult survey, we'll get a little bit more details into that, was the concept of coming around a national campaign called Farm Town Strong. And both National Farmers Union and the American Farm Bureau Federation have sponsored this effort, and this effort is, number one, to raise awareness, and also to provide resources for people to reach out and find ways to get assistance, and also just start the general conversation about rural opioid abuse. So Roger and Zippy, I'd like to get some more feedback from you all as to the results of the survey. What were some of the things that were surprising to you guys?
Well, so you mentioned the one thing that was a real surprise. 3 out of 4 farmers and ranchers were directly impacted. But to put that in context, the same survey indicated that about half of all rural Americans were directly impacted, and that something less than half of urban America directly impacted. So think of this. It's a big problem around the country. It's a bigger problem in rural America than urban America, and it's a much larger problem among farmers and ranchers and agriculture than it is in the rest of rural America. I mean, if that doesn't tell us that we need to focus on this as farm organizations, I don't know what does. One final thing that came out of that was striking to me is that when you asked farmers where they thought the problem was, most of them thought the problem was in urban America. And so it was those kind of results that led Zippy and myself and our staffs to conclude that really step one of this problem has got to be awareness and education and talking about here's the problem. Let's identify all the different parameters of it before we start talking too much about where we go next. Zippy?
Sure, and the survey definitely opened my eyes up because, you know, when we have something like this, whether it be opioid use or whether you have alcoholism in your community, everybody kind of turns ahead to it and they try to not see it. And so, you know, if you'd asked me that was a big problem in rural America before I had traveled and before we did this survey, I would have said, no, I don't think so. That's an urban problem. And so this survey really brought it to light to me. And I guess one of the things that was in that survey too was 3 out of 4 people said that they thought opioids were easy to be accessed or gotten out in rural America. Mm-hmm. And I would have never thought that. I mean, I would have never, if you asked me where you could go get some or where you'd find it, I wouldn't known how to answer that question. So that was really a shock to me. You know, Roger, I'm going to steal one of his lines, Roger, and I've used it ever since we had our meeting like this at our convention. Roger said, you know, when something happens to you over at your neighbor's farm, whether it be a storm or whatever it might be, you show up and you help them. And why would this tragedy not be any different? And Roger gave me that line at our convention, and I've used it a number of times since then, and I totally agree with him.
Yeah. So both of your groups have sounded the alarm on this issue. What made you join together around this specific issue?
So I would say maybe two things. One is, you know, when Zippy first came out to DC, and he's been out there, a couple of years now in this job, one of the things that I really wanted to do was to get to know him. And so we went out and had lunch, and we talked, and you know, we've become friends. And there is this sense that, particularly out in the countryside, that Farm Bureau and Farmers Union are often sort of at odds. And it's certainly true that we have differences, policy differences in lots of places. But it's also true that in way more areas we agree than we disagree.
Right.
And so sort of demonstrating that proactively seemed like a good thing to do. The other thing that was, at least in my mind, was, I don't know if you all have noticed what's going on in Washington, D.C. in these last number of years, but it's a pretty ugly, dysfunctional place. And, you know, we a lot of times laugh about it, but it's a really serious problem in my judgment. We don't have a good way of communicating and solving problems anymore in this country. And it seems like folks are just always at one another's throats. That's not just a problem in Congress, by the way. It's a problem out in our home communities. We all know it. It's harder to talk about some of these issues than it used to be. And it seems to me like those of us that are in a position where we can provide a bit of an example, we probably ought to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I guess for me, after we did the survey and it was so alarming to me, I started thinking about what had happened back in my own state and in my own community. And we have a Christian home in my community that helps men. It's a men's home. Helps men when they're going through such crisis, whether it be opioids, whether it be alcoholism, or whatever it might be. And you know, I got those men's faces started coming in my mind after that survey, because every year at revival at my church, we'd always invite them over, and they'd come in and sit through revival, and ended up singing at the end of the week. And I always just saw the men, but when we did this survey, their faces came back into my mind, and I said, you know, what if we could have done something to have prevented that person and their family around it having to go through this crisis? And then one of our farmers in South Georgia, his son had a knee operation, and some of the medication he went home with, he got addicted to it. And his son ended up in that Christian home. And then it became real to me, because one of the finest agricultural families in Southeast Georgia, and their son was in this crisis. Now the son has gotten through it, just remarried, got a whole new lease on life, just an unbelievable success story. But to see what his parents had to go through to get him through that was just devastating to me. So this kind of brought reality to it, and the survey kind of woke me up and put some faces to the issue. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, this is something we got to do. And I will say, what Roger said is true. He and I made a commitment. There's a lot more we agree on than what we disagree on between our organizations. And really the big issues we all agree on. And we should, as farmers, in my first year I spent as president, I talked about how we got to stay united, because if they splinter us off into different organizations, different commodities, different parts of the country, they splinter us off and we'll lose the power that we have in Washington. And really and truly, if you just look at what's happened recently, agriculture still swings a big stick, even though we're small in numbers. And we have some great people there. Secretary Perdue is a big fan of mine, and is there to help us fight those battles. So I think it's a great time for us to make a difference, and this is a great area for us to join. It's one of our first things to work together on.
Yeah.
And Zippy, you touched on it a little bit. When we start talking about the impact of the opioid epidemic on families, many times there's a stigma to it. Folks are reluctant to speak up and talk about how it's impacting them, and think about the farm family. How can communities help rally around these folks who are suffering? And we know that personal stories are important to help reduce the stigma around the addiction. And so what I'd like for each of the panelists is just to touch on a couple of stories, and you mentioned one already, of what have you heard about the impact of this crisis on these families? So Anne?
I can start. I think when we look at this issue in any context, there are a number of challenges, but particularly in rural America, it's really multifaceted. I think we can start with the family, and we look at the stress that this really puts on extended families, where you see grandparents raising so many generations of children because one or both parents are struggling with this issue. I think some numbers suggest that in certain states, Ohio, for example, that foster care loads are up nearly 50% because of the number of families that are impacted. So we have that immediate impact, and then what are those kids then going to be able to contribute in their own communities going forward? Those impacts continue. Then when we look at rural communities that are already often so challenged with limited budgets and maybe have difficult climates for business attraction, we see the challenge that this puts on resources for safety on roads, the lost productivity in our workforce, increased healthcare demands, a greater need for emergency response resources. Just last week, there was a summit held at the White House on this topic, and there was a county commissioner from West Virginia, Mercer County, I believe, and he expressed just the challenge that his county has experienced, and how the first, bill that they have to be concerned about every month is the bill for their jail system, because the jail is just overloaded with people that are there on drug-related charges because the addictions are so strong, and the impact that that has when they're spending money on their jails. They can't be spending money on economic attraction or education. And then lastly, I look at the impact that we see, particularly in agriculture, and the challenges that we see with our workforce. We have a egg processing company in my home state of Indiana that has had enormous challenges with this issue with employees, and just in talking to some of the folks there, talking about what it's like to manage this in their workforce, and they've really tried to come alongside their employees that are struggling with this because they see it as a disease. They want to be helpful, but the reality is when they're spending money investing those resources in a worker that's maybe struggling with this issue, those are dollars that they're not putting into additional opportunities for expanding their markets, which means opportunities for the producers that they work with. And so the trickle-down impact on all of us in agriculture and rural is very real.
Any personal comments?
So what comes to my mind is, and I don't know if Roger Weinmiller is here in the crowd or not, and I know he's okay with us talking about this, but you talk about Ohio. Roger's a farmer who, to give a really short version of an enormously long, challenging problem, today has one son remaining of his 3 children. One son, one daughter. Both died of overdoses in their 20s. He's farming with his remaining son, who's also addicted. Can you just imagine, as a parent, to have your adult children not just die, but all of the stress and strain and heartache leading up to that, when you know that there is this. This is a problem that is just so deep and it's so personal. And it just cries out for us to get past the stigma, folks. We have got to get to where to Zippy's point, we start embracing these folks and bringing them in, and we need to do things in communities to wrap our arms around one another, just the way that we do as farmers when somebody breaks a leg or has a heart attack or dies, and we go in and we put in the crop, or we take off the crop, or we do whatever is needed for as long as is needed to help that family through difficult times. That's what we really need to get to, and I just keep coming back to that and thinking about that.
And I think it's important to highlight the name of the campaign that y'all started, Farm Town Strong. And it really centers around the strength that the rural communities bring to help address this issue. And what I'd like for you all to highlight on are, what are some of the ways that the communities can help?
Well, in Farm Bureau, there's 2,700 county Farm Bureaus across the country, and we've seen, since we started this campaign, we've seen some counties kind of take ownership in it. Of course, you know, the biggest place we can make a difference is trying to educate people and bring awareness to it, hoping that we can head off future problems that might come up. You know, my wife is a cancer survivor, and she's had ovarian cancer, and every time she has a reoccurrence, I want to know what she's taking now that we've started talking about it. I never thought about looking at the medicines she was taking. Of course, she hadn't had a problem with any of it, but it just makes you more aware to pick that bottle up and look at what that medicine is and see whether or not it could be a potential problem for a loved one before it happens. And if we can get people to routinely think about what they're taking into their body and what it might do to them as far as addiction, maybe we could head some of that off, because sometimes fear of what it might do to you outweighs what it might help you with. But of course, Roger, you could talk a little bit about, we don't want to go too far with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really true. I've been taking opioids for years because I have pain in my spine, and lots of folks do. And the point is that it's a really good medication, and it works really well for lots of folks, but it impacts some folks differently than others. And so we want to be careful that we don't overreact to the point and say, okay, docs, you can't prescribe this. It's a powerful painkiller, and for folks that are really dealing with pain, if you've ever been in that position, you know that it is difficult to function unless you can deal with that. And so the balance is really important here. An interesting statistic, 80% of all the heroin users in the country started with prescription opioids. Think of that. Now, that's not to say that every opioid user legally using prescription opioids turns into a heroin addictee. That's not true at all. Most of them do not. The vast majority do not. But these linkages are something we just need to be really careful about understanding. And the point of this is to try and educate folks more and more about this so that we can deal with the problem and we can still have the tool for those where it's really needed.
You know, I think on the other side too, I mentioned the young man, it's a success story coming through this problem. You know, if we get them to realize that, you know, that there is no shame in this. Mm-hmm. I mean, any one of us in this room could be a victim of that under those conditions. And, you know, if we could get them to feel like there's no shame to it and come out and tell their story. Or, you know, I remember growing up with men that became alcoholics, and their families were ashamed of them. We shouldn't be ashamed of our family members or our community friends that fall victim to something like this. We should love them enough to want to help them. And that's what this Farm Town Strong campaign is about, you know, that we have some way to refer them to a resource, a family to a resource to where they can go look for help and to be able to be a real, true, loving neighbor.
Yeah, let's clap for that. So, do we have the facilities in rural America to address this problem?
I think there are some, depending on the data that you look at, there's some statistics that suggest that 82% of rural residents live in a county without any type of treatment resources. I can tell you firsthand, I think I'm on my 24th state now visit-wise, and since I came into this role last summer, I was recently in eastern Colorado, had a really neat opportunity to actually participate in a telemedicine session with someone who was hours away from the town that we were in, but basically sits at a room and does different sessions with patients all day long. And I was told that if it weren't for this one physician, that essentially, you know, from Denver to the Kansas border, you would not have access to somebody that can provide these services. And I don't know how many miles that is. It's several hundred. That's pretty staggering.
So, what about Washington? We know that Secretary Perdue recently assigned USDA Rural Development to lead the effort in this matter. And so, how can our organizations assist you in your efforts?
Well, I will share just briefly a number of things that we are doing. And let me first start by just lifting up the leadership of your organization and the two men sitting to my left. I think we've already heard a lot of discussion about stigma, and I can't underscore how much strength we have in the leadership here, being willing to talk about this in forums such as this, as well as the Farm Bureau meeting in January. A lot of this starts with getting it out in the open and talking about it so that others can step up and be part of the solution as well at that community level. We, under Secretary Perdue's leadership, are focused very narrowly, laser-like, on rural prosperity, and we see this issue as more than a health issue. It is a matter of prosperity in our small towns and rural places. It is affecting everything from our workforce, so those jobs and economic opportunities that we want for not only this generation, but generations to come. It affects the quality of life in these places. So with that, we are tackling this on a number of fronts. First, we have a number of program resources that can be used by communities to build an effective local response. These are resources that really fit into three buckets: prevention, treatment, and recovery. As we make investments in these programs in the new year, we are looking at how these programs can be used most effectively in assisting communities. We have a team of rural development staff, as well as 11 of our state directors that are out leading the teams in your respective states, that are looking specifically at how we can use our existing program resources in workforce, community planning, and then transition housing and other community facilities to help connect communities to some of these resources, as well as best practices and the resources of our partners like Farmtown Strong. We also recently launched an opioids webpage on the USDA website. It's very basic and simple right now, and the idea is that we're going to build it up as we come across those best practices that we can lift up. In addition to the programs that we have, last year, Secretary Perdue led an interagency task force on agriculture and rural prosperity, and this brought together 22 different federal agencies and departments, all that have resources devoted to rural. Mental and behavioral health, including substance abuse, including the opioid epidemic, was a key topic of discussion in a work group that I led on quality of life. And there were a series of recommendations that came out of the task force. They were released in January. We're just beginning at looking at implementation of those recommendations. But I see a huge opportunity to address this issue as we move forward with implementing some of those recommendations, because at the federal level, there are a number of resources that are scattered throughout different departments, and we really as a federal family need to coordinate. In addition, many of your state leaders are very focused on this issue, and there's dollars that are flowing from Washington to the states, often in a very flexible form, and so it's upon us to be having a strong coordination dialogue between our partners in the federal family and folks in the state and local levels to make sure that there aren't gaps with respect to rural. Another activity that we are focused on in this space, I would imagine you'll have a fair amount of discussion over the next few days regarding the Farm Bill. And as Congress moves forward with the Farm Bill, specifically in that Rural Development title, we see a number of opportunities within our existing programs that we've been in dialogue with them about how to have our tools be more effective to address this issue. And then lastly, Secretary Perdue has created a Rural Development Innovation Center, and this is a team within rural development. It's a new team that's really working alongside our state directors and trying to find what some of those best practices are in one community that another community might be able to adopt. I think you will quickly see if you step in and start working either in your own town or in other towns across your state that no two communities are the same. You know that firsthand living and working in these places. But some communities have similarly situated assets. Maybe it's a really strong church, or maybe it's a sheriff that understands this issue and wants to partner with the schools. There are a number of different ways to address this, and sometimes when we see assets between two communities that are similar, one community can learn from another that's already been there.
Oh, thank you. So, what can individuals and small organizations do now to address this crisis when they go back home to their rural community? So what would be some of your recommendations?
Well, I think one of the things that you all ought to do when you go back home is to start having conversations among your locals, your counties, your state organization, and in your communities, outside of the Farmers Union family, in your communities. At its core, I think this is an issue that's got to be resolved at local levels with folks embracing one another. Lest we somehow think that this is kind of an abstract thing, in 2016, more people died in this country from drug overdoses than all the folks who died in the Vietnam War. I mean, just think about that. This is a really, really big problem. But while it's a big problem on the national level, I think it cries out for local solutions. And we'll have lots of conversations about how we can bring resources, all those kinds of things, whether they should come from the federal government, from private sector, from philanthropic organizations, or wherever. But at its core, we just have to have, we want to put together sort of a series of best practices that, when I say we, I mean very collectively here, that folks can use in local communities to talk about some of the things that Anne talked about and to try and figure out, okay, how can we, maybe just getting together and having a community dinner or lunch or breakfast or whatever. It seems like as the years go on, we do less and less of that. We need to reverse that trend and start doing more and more of that and communicating with one another.
Yeah. One story that resonated with me that Anne had explained to me was that there was a community in Ohio where a lady, she just started having big dinners. She knew that there was a lot of rural isolation. And what did she say to you? She didn't even really like to cook.
Yeah, this is I would encourage anybody, this dinner actually has a website now, so I'd encourage you to go if this story inspires you at all. But I'm going to go back to the town that I started with in my introduction, Austin, Indiana. It's a town of about 4,000 people, which for some of you is very large, but from where I come from, Indiana, that's a relatively small town. And there's a woman named Becky Williams in Austin who just noticed that there were a group of people in her town that seemed isolated and were in need. And so she and a friend got a crock pot and started cooking on Thursday nights. This dinner now is grown to over 200 people. And what you see happening there is much more than a meal. many folks that, especially as you fall into addiction, feel stigma and shame and they're isolated. A dinner like Food for Our Souls, this dinner has a name now, is actually a place that people can come together and be encouraged and receive much more than just physical nourishment. There's friendship and relationship that they might not otherwise have access to.
Concluding.
The thing I love about Food for Our Souls is it's a simple example of something that I think we can all step into now. It's easy to feel very overwhelmed working in this space because we want that magic silver bullet to come down. And that's one of the reasons that I love the name Farmtown Strong for the initiative that Farmers Union and Farm Bureau have put forward, because in my work in this area, I really do believe the solution is at that local community level. It's strong local communities, and some of this is not overly complicated. It can be simple, just relationship, person to person, having everybody to feel value and not alone in their struggles.
Well, thank you all very much for sharing your insights and your experiences on this very important issue. And just want to make sure for everyone in the audience, please tell your friends and colleagues that on Monday, March 12th at 8 p.m. Central Time, Rural America Live on RFD TV will be hosting an hour-long feature program on Farmtown Strong. The program will have a panel with Roger, Zippy, and Anne, 2 stories about the opioid crisis in farming communities, and another panel of experts and those that have been impacted. So again, share that information. Again, it's just another wonderful way to get the word out about Farmtown Strong. So again, thank you very much for joining us today to help us raise awareness of this devastating epidemic. Thank you.